The low, rhythmic thumping against a shared wall at 3 in the morning is a sound that shouldn't exist in a quiet neighborhood. Yet for one family, it was the first heartbeat of a living nightmare. Hello everyone, and welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here tonight as we pull back the curtain on the places where we should feel the safest. We often view our backyards as private sanctuaries, small patches of earth where we are the masters of our own domain. We build fences, install motion lights, and lock our gates, convinced that these thin boundaries are enough to keep the chaos of the world at bay. But sometimes, the most terrifying threats don't come from the street. They are already breathing the same air as you, just on the other side of a piece of drywall or a pane of glass. Tonight, we are exploring 4 true accounts that redefine the meaning of a home invasion. We'll start with a suburban house swap that spiraled into a violent criminal underworld drama involving staged burglaries and a neighbor who wasn't who he claimed to be. From there, we'll travel to a split-level home in Montreal, where a teenage girl spent years suspecting a presence outside her window, only to find the truth was far more persistent than a ghost. Then, we'll uncover the horrifying secret hidden behind a built-in bookshelf in an Alberta basement, where a family realized they had never truly been alone. Finally, we will delve into a 4th account of a sprawling rural backyard where the edge of the forest seemed to move closer every night, hiding a watcher who had made themselves at home long before the owners arrived. These stories are a sobering look at how easily our privacy can be compromised. If you enjoy these deep dives into the unsettling reality of the everyday, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support allows me to keep bringing these narratives to life. So make sure your doors are bolted, take a deep breath, and let's step into the shadows of these 4 backyard horror stories. The transition from our first home to our second felt like a natural progression of a life well lived. We had spent 18 months in our modest starter home, cultivating a garden and building a rapport with neighbors who had become more like family than acquaintances. When they decided to move, the opportunity to purchase their larger property felt like a gift. It was a house that promised a new chapter, complete with a garage for the car, a driveway for guests, and a bathtub that offered a sanctuary at the end of a long day. We sold our original home to a Polish couple who, on the surface, seemed to embody the same quiet stability we valued. They were polite, if a bit reserved, choosing to communicate solely in English, rather than the Dutch we typically used in the neighborhood. We shared small talk and offered tips on the house's quirks, believing we were handing over our past to capable hands. However, the atmosphere began to shift almost immediately after the keys changed hands. It started with disturbances that defied the traditional rhythm of a suburban street. At midnight, when the neighborhood should have been blanketed in silence, we would hear heavy, rhythmic banging coming through the shared walls. On other nights, music would erupt at a deafening volume without warning, a jarring wall of sound that felt aggressive in its suddenness. It wasn't a constant noise, which in many ways made it more stressful. It was an unpredictable intrusion that made us realize we had no true understanding of who was living just a few feet away from our own. The first undeniable sign that something was deeply wrong occurred when the husband returned home with his car, looking as though it had been through a war zone. Deep, jagged scrapes ran the entire length of both sides of the vehicle, the kind of damage that only happens when a car is forced through a space far too narrow at high speeds. When we asked what had happened, his explanation was hollow and lacked the weight of truth. He claimed to have hit a concrete pole on one side, and then, in a separate but equally unlikely accident, a trailer had taken a turn too wide and clipped him on the other. We chose to believe him because it was easier than the alternative, even though the math of his story simply didn't add up. A few weeks later, the situation escalated from strange to frantic. It was around 6 p.m. when the neighbor called us in a state of total panic. He claimed that people were outside his house at that very moment, turning his security cameras away to blind the property. He sounded absolutely terrified and begged us to check on the house and call the police for him. We looked over and saw that he was telling the truth. 2 men were actively breaking into the home. We called the authorities immediately, but by the time they arrived 20 minutes later, the burglars had already vanished. The scene that followed was a chaotic blur. The neighbor's wife came racing onto the street, parking her car haphazardly before running inside to check on her dog and speak with the officers. While this was happening, I was out walking my own dog, watching the aftermath from the sidewalk. That was when I noticed something very strange. I saw the husband park his car 3 streets away and walk toward his own house on foot. He was moving with a deliberate caution, as if he were intentionally hiding his vehicle and himself from the police who were already on the scene. The thought that he was avoiding the authorities didn't fully register in that moment of high adrenaline. But it was a sign that the victim, in this situation, might have been playing a very different role. Later that evening, we sat down to check our own doorbell camera footage to see if we had caught anything useful for the investigation. What we saw chilled us. The camera had captured the 2 burglars standing outside the house before the break-in began. They weren't rushed or looking over their shoulders. They were standing there with a calm, casual demeanor, discussing which house to target and polish. Despite the broken door and the apparent invasion, nothing was actually stolen from the home. No suspects were caught that night. I told the police that the entire incident felt like a staged event, a piece of theater designed to make them look like victims, but I never heard back. We were left living next to a house that had become a complete mystery, and we were starting to realize that the people we had sold our home to were leading lives we couldn't even begin to understand. The deceptive calm following that first strange burglary didn't last long. It was as if the air itself had become heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. A week later, I was attending a housewarming party for a friend, trying to lose myself in the normal, happy chatter of people who didn't have to worry about what was happening on the other side of their living room wall. My partner had stayed behind at our house, and throughout the evening, my phone began to buzz with increasingly anxious updates. The first few messages were familiar complaints. The music next door had returned, and it was reaching a volume that made our own walls vibrate. But then the messages stopped, and my phone began to ring. When I answered, the voice on the other end was unrecognizable. My partner wasn't just annoyed. He was speaking in the hushed, frantic tones of someone witnessing a crime in progress. He told me that the quiet of the evening had been shattered by the roar of an engine and the sickening sound of metal crumpling against wood and brick. A car had come tearing through our front garden, destroying the lawn we had spent months manicuring, and had slammed directly into the neighbor's front door. It wasn't an accident. It was a targeted, structural assault. As I stood in the middle of a crowded party, my partner described the scene unfolding just feet away from him. 2 men had jumped out of the car and were frantically hauling items out of the house. They weren't grabbing small valuables. They were dragging out massive flat-screen TVs, professional-grade audio speakers, and expensive electronic gear that looked far too specialized for a standard residential home. My partner recognized them immediately. They were the same men who had been lingering around the property during the burglary the week before. This time, the police response was different. Perhaps it was the report of a vehicle being used as a battering ram, but the authorities arrived in exactly 7 minutes. They pulled onto the street just as the men were trying to reverse the car away from the mangled front entrance. The officers boxed them in and approached the driver's side with their weapons drawn. When they demanded identification, the suspects claimed they had none. Then, the situation took a turn into the truly surreal. The man behind the wheel looked the lead officer directly in the eye and calmly claimed to be our neighbor. Reciting his actual name without a hint of hesitation. It was a bold gamble. But it was undone by a detail the criminal couldn't have known. In the 9 months that our neighbors had lived next to us, the husband had never spoken a single word of Dutch. He had communicated with everyone on the street exclusively in English. Yet the man sitting in that crashed car was speaking fluent Dutch with a thick Polish accent. The officers immediately sensed the deception. Realizing the game was up, the driver slammed the car into gear, and a violent, desperate pursuit began through our narrow suburban streets. We listened over the phone to the screech of tires and the distant wail of sirens until the police finally managed to box them in several blocks away. Even with the suspects in handcuffs, the house wasn't empty. My partner told the officers on the scene that he could still hear movement, heavy, frantic footsteps coming from the second floor of the neighbor's house. The police went back inside, clearing the rooms one by one, and dragged out a third suspect who had been hiding in the shadows. We were sitting inside our own home with an officer, trying to document the damage to our garden and process the fact that our old house had become a hub for what looked like a professional theft ring. When the doorbell rang, we turned around, expecting perhaps another officer, but instead we saw the actual neighbor. He was a terrifying sight. His face was a swollen purple mess of bruises. One eye was swollen completely shut, his mouth was torn, and his arm hung at a useless broken angle. He was covered in what looked like defensive stab wounds, his clothes shredded and soaked in blood. He looked feral, aggressive, and utterly broken. The officer tried to step in, calling for a medic and attempting to get a statement about who had done this to him. But the neighbor's reaction was chilling. He flatly refused to cooperate. He wouldn't file a report, he wouldn't name his attackers, and he wouldn't even acknowledge that a crime had taken place. He stared at us with a look of pure, unadulterated coldness. Because the victim of the assault refused to speak, the police eventually had no choice but to let him limp back into his house. Later that night, long after the sirens had faded, he rang our bell again. He was trembling, his body shaking with a mix of shock and genuine terror. He finally began to talk, but the story he told wasn't about a burglary. He confessed that he had been cheating on his wife, and he was convinced that she was the one who had sent those men to take him out. He stood there, bloodied and desperate, begging to sleep at our house because he was terrified to be alone in the home where he had just been tortured. As much as we felt a shred of human pity for him, we were also completely overwhelmed. We didn't want any part of this underworld drama that had spilled into our lives. We were just normal people who had wanted a bigger house and a driveway, and now we were looking at a man whose life was entangled with violent criminals. We refused his request to stay, but my partner offered to drive him to the hospital instead. He needed medical attention we couldn't provide, and frankly, we needed him away from our property. We dropped him off at the hospital at 10:30 p.m. and told him clearly that we weren't going back home, that we were staying elsewhere for the night because we no longer felt safe. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. We just wanted the cycle of knocks and pleas to end. In reality, we went straight back home, locked every door, and sat in the dark, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. At around 1 a.m., our dog started to growl. It wasn't his usual alert bark. It was a specific low, guttural growl that he only uses when someone is standing directly at the door. My heart plummeted. We checked the doorbell camera, and there he was again. The neighbor had somehow made his way back from the hospital and was standing on our porch, ringing the doorbell over and over. We sat there in the pitch black, watching the glowing screen of our phone, paralyzed. We didn't move. We didn't make a sound. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a pair of headlights turned onto the street. Through the camera, we saw the neighbor's demeanor change from desperation to sheer panic. He scrambled off the porch, but he didn't go back to his own house. Instead, he hid behind our cars in the driveway, crouching in the shadows like a hunted animal. The car stopped, and a woman stepped out. It was his wife. She walked toward her front door, but she paused, her head turning slowly toward her driveway. She saw him. We held our breath, waiting for a confrontation. Instead, she walked toward him, and as she stepped into the pale yellow glow of the street lamp, she began to wail. It was a haunting, guttural crying that seemed to vibrate through the walls of our house. He didn't say a word. She kept asking questions, her sobbing getting louder until it echoed through the empty street. Eventually, they both got into the car and drove away. We didn't see them again for 3 days. When the wife finally returned, she was alone. She found the dog inside the house and told us she didn't think she would ever see her husband again. Whatever the real story was, whether it was drugs, debt, or a marriage that had turned lethal, I realized one thing. I didn't want to know the transition from the volatile streets of the Netherlands to the quiet, snow-dusted suburbs of Montreal was supposed to be our family's final arrival at peace. In 2017, my parents, my little sister, and I moved into a house that, on the surface, looked like the archetype of suburban safety. However, the architecture of this new home played a cruel trick on my sense of security. It was a split-level design, a style where the floors are staggered, meaning my bedroom wasn't quite on the main floor, but wasn't fully submerged in the basement either. It sat at an awkward, vulnerable ground level. The layout of that room is something I can still map out with my eyes closed. One wall was shared with the cold, concrete expanse of the garage, while the opposite side featured a large, wide window that offered a panoramic view of our backyard. At 15, I didn't think much of the windows covering plastic vertical blinds that were missing several panels. Even when I pulled them shut, jagged gaps remained, like missing teeth in a smile, through which the outside world could still peer in. Directly across from that window, on the garage wall, were my closet's sliding mirror doors. This configuration created a permanent loop of surveillance. No matter which way I turned in bed, I was either looking at the window or looking at the mirror's perfect, silver reflection of the window. The unease didn't arrive with a bang. It grew like mold in the corners of my mind. About a year after we moved in, I began to struggle with the typical insomnia of a teenager, spending my late nights bathed in the blue light of my tablet. It was a sweltering summer night, and because we didn't have air conditioning yet, I had slid the window open as far as it would go to catch the faint Canadian breeze. Suddenly, over the sound of a YouTube video, I heard a distinct shuffling in the grass. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was the heavy, deliberate drag of a foot. I froze and paused the video. The silence that followed was absolute, which only made my heart hammer harder against my ribs. I convinced myself it was a sound effect from the stream, or perhaps the house settling in the heat. But a few nights later, the sound returned, and this time I paused the audio for much longer. In the vacuum of noise, I heard it, a rhythmic, wet sound of someone breathing just inches away from the mesh screen. I stared at the gaps in the blinds, but the darkness outside was a solid wall. I turned over to face the closet, desperate to look at anything else, but as I adjusted my tablet, my eyes caught the mirror. There, reflected in the glass through one of the missing blind panels, I saw a silhouette shift. I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the room and woke my parents, my voice shaking as I described the breathing and the shadow. My father, ever the pragmatist, grabbed a flashlight and marched into the backyard. He returned 10 minutes later with a skeptical sigh. He had checked every corner, looked at the squeaky gate that surely would have alerted him to an intruder, and even checked the Ring camera. There was nothing. He told me I was watching too many horror movies, and that the safe neighborhood we lived in didn't harbor monsters. I wanted to believe him. For the next several months, I forced myself to accept his logic, even as the shuffling returned every few weeks. Asterisk, asterisk. Then came the winter of 2018. In Montreal, winter is a fortress of ice and snow. The backyard became an impassable wasteland of white, and the sound stopped. I felt a profound sense of relief, thinking the shadow had been a summer fever dream. But as the ground thawed in the spring of 2019, the presence returned with a predictable, terrifying schedule. It always happened after 11 p.m., once the rest of the house had gone dark. I developed a system of survival. I would wear noise-canceling headphones. I would turn the brightness on my tablet down, and I would never, under any circumstances, look at the mirror. I lived in a state of self-imposed denial, terrified that if I truly went looking for the truth, I would find something I couldn't unsee. By 2021, the stress had become a background radiation in my life. I was watching a stream with my boyfriend over Discord late one December night while a massive windstorm battered the house. The wind was so violent it made the siding shriek, and I decided to head to the kitchen for water to calm my nerves. On my way, I saw my parents sitting in the living room, their faces pale and rigid in the dim light. They looked like they were waiting for a death in the family. When I asked what was wrong, they ushered me back to my room with a frantic urgency. Asterisk flashes of red and blue light began to pulse against my bedroom walls. A police cruiser had pulled into our driveway. Moments later, my father called me back upstairs and finally told me the truth. He had gone into the backyard minutes earlier to secure some loose patio furniture against the storm. As the light from my bedroom window spilled out onto the grass, he saw him. A man was standing perfectly still, his face pressed toward the glass of my window, staring into the room where I had spent the last 4 years. My father had chased him, but the man was agile, leaping over the back fence with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 100 times before. In an instant, the years of imagination were validated as a long-term stalking campaign. My parents went to the neighbor's house to warn her, but the older woman who lived there refused to open her door, instead screaming at my parents to leave, or she would call the police herself. Her reaction was so defensive, so strangely hostile, that it left us wondering if she was protecting the man, or if she was simply the next victim in his line of sight. The police increased patrols, and we finally replaced the blinds and installed a fortress of cameras, but the damage was done. I moved to a room facing the street, unable to ever trust the backyard again. The realization that someone had watched me grow from a 15-year-old girl into an adult, knowing my every habit and the exact moment I turned off my lights, is a violation that doesn't wash off. I still wonder who he was, a neighbor, a stranger passing through, or someone who had been there long before we ever bought the house. It was a biting mid-December day in suburban Alberta when we began our move into the house that seemed like our biggest stroke of luck. At 15, my world revolved around my family, and with a baby sister on the way, our cramped apartment had become an obstacle to our future. Finding a house just a few blocks away with a for sale sign that boasted an impossibly low price felt like a miracle. It wasn't the most beautiful structure on the block, and the neighborhood had a reputation for being a bit rough around the edges, but it offered the one thing we lacked: room to grow. My parents were convinced that with enough sweat equity and the money we saved on the purchase price, we could renovate it into a sanctuary. My father focused his initial efforts on the basement. When we first walked through it, the space was almost unusable, dark, damp, and smelling of ancient dust. He spent months tearing out rotted wood, installing new support beams, laying down fresh carpeting, and fixing the bathroom. I was even given the agency to choose the wallpaper for my new bedroom in that basement, picking out a cool, modern pattern that made the space feel entirely mine. For the first few months, life in the new house was idyllic. We were settling into our routines, enjoying the extra square footage, and feeling the excitement of my mother's pregnancy. That sense of security was the first thing to break. It happened on my father's birthday. To celebrate, the entire family headed out to a local restaurant for a rare evening of relaxation. When we pulled back into the driveway a few hours later, the celebration died instantly. Our front door was standing wide open, swinging slowly in the freezing December wind. My mother went pale, her voice trembling as she begged my father not to go inside. She called the police from the truck, but my father, driven by a protective instinct that outweighed his caution, grabbed a heavy wrench from his toolbox and stepped into the house, alone to search for an intruder. Those 5 minutes while we waited for the police were some of the longest of my life. When the officers finally arrived and conducted a sweep, they found my father safe, but the house empty. Strangely, the usual signs of a burglary were missing. My expensive electronics were untouched, and my mother's jewelry sat undisturbed on her dresser. However, the house had been tampered with in a way that felt much more personal. Several items had been knocked over or moved with deliberate intent. In my room, specifically, the books on my shelf had been shifted, as if someone had been running their fingers along the spines, looking for something hidden behind them. The police eventually left, chalking it up to a potential intruder who got spooked and fled. But the house never felt empty again after that night. Living in the basement, I began to hear noises that defied the logic of an old building. There were muffled thumps and scratching sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls, or even from the foundation beneath the floorboards. I tried to dismiss them as the pipes or the building settling in the extreme Alberta cold, but deep down, I knew the rhythm of the house had changed. The most unexplainable moment came at 2 o'clock in the morning while I was lying under my sheets, playing my Nintendo DS with the volume muted. In the absolute silence of the basement, I heard it, a clear, short burst of laughter coming from the wall right beside my bed. My heart froze. I lay perfectly still for 30 minutes, my eyes wide in the dark, waiting for a second sound. When it never came, I convinced myself it was a trick of my sleep-deprived mind. I woke up the next morning and tried to pass it off as a dream, even though the sound of that chuckle remained burned into my memory dot by the time my sister was born. The basement had become our shared space. My mother, wanting to keep a close ear on the baby while she was upstairs, set up a baby monitor system with receiver units in the kitchen and the living room. It was this piece of technology that finally stripped away the illusion of our safety. One night, while my parents were out for a late dinner and I was in the kitchen, the monitor crackled to life. It wasn't the sound of my sister waking up. It was the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps, not on the floor, but seemingly within the structure of the house. Terrified, I heard a faint she sound come through the speaker, followed by the loud crash of the monitor unit being knocked over in the basement. In a blind panic, I did something that could have been a fatal mistake. I ran to my father's room and grabbed his rifle. I didn't have the key for the trigger lock or any ammunition, but I figured I could bluff. I hid the lock with my hand, pretending the weapon was hot, and crept down the basement stairs. I yelled that I was armed and to come out, but the silence that met me was heavy and suffocating. My sister was crying in her crib, and the monitor lay on the floor, but the room appeared empty. I grabbed my sister and bolted back upstairs, shoving a heavy chair under the basement door handle before calling my parents and the police. When the officers arrived, they performed another standard sweep and once again found no one. They were about to leave when my father, looking at the wall of my bedroom, asked a question that confused everyone. "Did you check behind the bookshelf?" The bookshelf was a massive unit that appeared to be built into the wall itself. The officer joined my father in the basement, and when they pulled on the side of the wooden frame, the entire unit swung outward on hidden hinges. It was a door. Behind it lay a small, cramped room built into the crawl space of the house, surrounded by insulation and pipes. The floor was a graveyard of our missing things. We found wrappers from the snacks we had bought for our lunches, our missing coffee mugs, and bottles of lotion. Most horrifying was a partially eaten apple on a ledge. The flesh was still white and fresh. Someone had been sitting in that room, eating that apple while I was upstairs in the kitchen. Next to it lay an open switchblade. The police realized the intruder had escaped through the basement window, using my own desk chair as a step to scramble out into the yard while we were talking to the officers at the front door. But the true horror came a few days later when I went back into that hidden space with a flashlight. Near the area that lined up with my bed, I found a tiny jagged hole bored through the wood and the wallpaper. I pressed my eye to it and realized that from that dark, hidden room, the intruder had a perfect, unobstructed view of my entire life. They had watched me sleep, watched me change, and listened to every private conversation I had ever had. We weren't just being robbed. We were being harvested. I'm an adult now, and I live far away from that house. But I still can't look at a built-in cabinet or a heavy piece of furniture without wondering what might be breathing on the other side. My parents still live there, and though they've gutted the hidden room and bolted the shelf shut, the house remains a place I can never truly call home. Again, that there is a specific kind of silence that exists in the rural stretches of the Pacific Northwest, a silence that doesn't feel like the absence of noise, but rather like a heavy, living thing that watches you from between the trees. After years of saving every cent we earned, my husband and I finally walked away from the city. We bought a 3-acre property that bordered a protected national forest. The house was an old A-frame with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a backyard that bled directly into the pines. At the time, we called it a sanctuary. We spent our first few months there, intoxicated by the privacy, feeling as though we had finally found a corner of the world that belonged solely to us. The backyard was our pride. It was a vast, sloping stretch of grass that ended abruptly at a wall of Douglas firs and thick underbrush. We spent our weekends clearing the perimeter, installing a high-end motion sensor lighting system, and building a stone fire pit near the tree line. We wanted to enjoy the woods without feeling consumed by them. But as autumn turned into a damp, foggy winter, the relationship between our home and the forest began to change. It started with the motion lights. On a Tuesday night, around 11 p.m., the floodlights at the back of the house flared to life. We were sitting on the sofa, and the sudden wash of white light against the fog made the backyard look like a stage. I looked out the window, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a stray coyote, but the grass was empty. After 30 seconds, the lights clicked off, plunging the yard back into a charcoal darkness. 10 minutes later, they flared again. This cycle repeated for hours. We checked the sensors, thinking perhaps a low-hanging branch was triggering them in the wind, but the air was perfectly still. The lights weren't reacting to the weather. They were reacting to something moving with a specific, rhythmic pace just outside their range. A few days later, the gifts started appearing. I was out gardening near the stone fire pit when I found a small, neatly arranged pile of animal bones on the flat surface of a rock. They were bleached white, completely stripped of meat, and arranged in a deliberate circle. I tried to tell myself it was a bird of prey or a scavenger, but the arrangement was too geometric, too purposeful. I swept them into the brush and didn't tell my husband, not wanting to sound like the paranoid city girl I feared I was becoming. But the next morning, the circle was back, and this time, it was accompanied by a small, hand-carved wooden figurine, a crude, faceless human shape propped up against the base of our back door, The unease transitioned into a visceral terror during the first heavy frost of the year. The morning frost acts like a photographic plate for the night's activities. And when I looked out our bedroom window, I saw a trail of footprints. They didn't come from the driveway or the road. They emerged from the densest part of the forest, walked directly to our back window, and stayed there. The frost was trampled down into a dark, muddy patch right beneath the glass where I had been sleeping. The person had stood there long enough for the heat from their body to melt the ice on the windowsill. They hadn't just passed through. They had lingered. My husband, finally seeing the physical evidence, called the local sheriff. The officer who arrived was a grizzled man who had lived in the area for 40 years. He walked the perimeter of the backyard, his boots crunching in the frozen mud, until he reached the edge of the woods. He beckoned us over, his face uncharacteristically grim. He pointed to a spot about 20 yards into the tree line, hidden behind a massive moss-covered log. There, tucked into the roots of an ancient cedar, was a nest. It was a makeshift shelter constructed of pine boughs, old tarps, and most disturbingly, several items from our own backyard. Our missing garden trowel was there, along with a pair of my husband's work gloves and a wind chime that had blown away weeks prior. But it wasn't just a campsite. Hanging from the low branches of the cedar were dozens of photographs. They weren't digital prints. They were old-school Polaroids, pinned to the bark with sewing needles. The photos were of us. There was a shot of me hanging laundry. There was a photo of my husband sitting by the fire pit, his back turned to the woods. Most were taken at night, captured through the long-distance lens of someone sitting in that very nest, looking through our floor-to-ceiling windows. The sanctuary we thought we had built was actually a fishbowl, and we had been the evening entertainment for a ghost in the pines. The sheriff searched the area, but the occupant was gone, likely alerted by the sound of the patrol car on the gravel drive. They found a small diary in the nest, filled with a sprawling, illegible shorthand that documented our daily schedules, what time we woke up, when we left for work, and which windows we forgot to lock. The person had been living in our backyard for months, moving through the shadows like a part of the ecosystem. We sold the A-frame 3 months later. We moved back toward the city, choosing a house with a small, boring backyard and neighbors so close we can hear their televisions through the walls. People ask us why we gave up our dream home in the forest, and we just tell them that we realized we aren't outdoorsy people. But the truth is, I can no longer look at a line of trees without seeing a face between the branches. I realized that the fences we build don't just keep things out sometimes, they create a private, enclosed world for the things that are already watching us from the dark. Hope you enjoyed these 4 accounts of the horrors that can hide in the places we call home. Remember, the next time you feel a chill while standing in your backyard, don't just dismiss it as the wind. Sometimes your intuition is the only thing that knows you're not alone. Good night, stay safe, and make sure your curtains are closed tight. The discovery of the hidden passage in our Alberta home wasn't just a shock. It was a total dismantling of our reality. When my father and the officer finally managed to swing that heavy bookshelf away from the wall, revealed by the rhythmic interference on the baby monitor, they didn't just find a crawl space. They found a life. The space behind the wood was a narrow, claustrophobic corridor built into the very bones of the basement, running alongside the pipes that carried the heat and water for our family. It was a space designed to be invisible, yet it was filled with the mundane debris of our daily existence. In the beam of the officer's flashlight, we saw the missing pieces of our home scattered on the dusty floor. There were the snack wrappers from my lunch, the coffee mugs that my mother had spent weeks looking for, and several bottles of lotion. The air in that small void was thick and smelled of unwashed clothes and stale food. Most chilling of all was the apple. It sat on a small ledge near where the pipes entered the wall, a half-eaten red delicious. Its flesh was still white and moist, only just starting to brown at the edges. Whoever had been living in the hollows of our home had been sitting right there, eating that apple, while we were in the kitchen just a few feet away. Beside it lay a silver switchblade, left open in a hurry. The officer realized that the intruder had heard the commotion at the front door and used that distraction to flee. A desk chair from my own room had been dragged into the crawl space and positioned beneath the small, high basement window. The window was unlatched and swinging in the wind, leading directly into the shadows of our backyard. While the police searched the neighborhood, the true violation didn't hit me until a few days later. Driven by a morbid need to understand, I crawled into that hidden room myself with a flashlight. I followed the line of the wall until I reached the section that backed up against my bed and my dresser. That's when I found the hole. It was a tiny, jagged puncture in the wood and wallpaper, no larger than a pinprick from the outside, but perfectly positioned for a watcher on the inside. Asterisk, asterisk, I pressed my eye to that hole and felt a wave of nausea. From that dark, hidden vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my entire bedroom. I could see my pillow, the desk where I did my homework, and the dresser where I changed my clothes. For months, while I thought I was alone, someone had been inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of drywall, watching my every move. They had watched me sleep, listened to my phone calls, and learned the intimate rhythm of my life. The police suggested we bolt the bookshelf shut and install iron bars on the windows, which my father did immediately. But you can't bolt a memory shut. We lived in that house for 5 more years, and in all that time, I never slept with my back to that wall again. Every time the house creaked or the wind whistled through the pipes, I would find myself staring at the bookshelf, wondering if the weight behind it had shifted. After the trauma of the Alberta house, my family eventually moved to a rural property in the Pacific Northwest, seeking the kind of isolation that only a deep forest can provide. We bought a beautiful A-frame home that sat on 3 acres of land, bordering a protected national forest. The backyard was a sprawling emerald green lawn that ended abruptly at a wall of ancient Douglas firs. We thought that by moving away from the suburbs, we were moving away from people and their prying eyes. We thought the trees were our friends. For the first year, it was a dream. The only neighbors we had were the deer that would occasionally wander onto the lawn at dawn. We spent our evenings on the back deck, listening to the wind move through the pines, convinced that we were finally safe in our own secluded world. But during the second winter, the forest began to feel less like a backdrop and more like a presence dot. It started with the nesting spots. I was out walking our dog along the edge of the property line when I noticed a patch of grass that had been flattened in a perfect, human-sized rectangle. It was hidden behind a cluster of ferns, positioned so that anyone lying there would have a direct line of sight through our sliding glass kitchen doors. I dismissed it as a place where a deer might have bedded down, despite the fact that there were no animal tracks nearby. Asterisk, asterisk, then came the sounds. In the dead of night, we would hear a low, rhythmic tapping on the glass of the back door. It wasn't the sound of a branch. It was the distinct sound of a knuckle hitting the pane. 3 taps, then silence. By the time my husband would get to the door and flip on the floodlights, the yard would be empty. The shadows of the trees stretched long and knocking across the grass. The final breaking point occurred on a night when a heavy fog had rolled in from the coast, turning the backyard into a sea of white. Our motion sensor lights began to trigger repeatedly, flashing on and off with a frantic mechanical click. We looked out the window, and through the shifting layers of mist, we saw a figure standing at the very edge of the tree line. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, a dark silhouette against the gray fog, watching the house. When the police arrived and searched the perimeter, they found something even more disturbing than a stalker. About 50 yards into the woods, they found a permanent camp. It was a small, well-hidden tent made of camouflage tarps. Inside, they found a collection of items stolen from our backyard over the past year. A pair of my garden shears, a wind chime that had blown away in a storm, and a notebook. The notebook was filled with a meticulously detailed log of our lives. It recorded what time we turned off the lights, what we ate for dinner, and which doors we sometimes left unlocked. But the most terrifying discovery was a series of photographs not taken from a distance, but taken from inside our own backyard, looking through the windows while we were sleeping. The privacy of our rural sanctuary was a total illusion. We had been living in a goldfish bowl, and the forest had been watching us the entire time. We sold the A-frame and moved back to a town where the houses are close together, and the backyards are small and visible to everyone. People often ask us why we left such a beautiful, quiet place. We tell them we missed the convenience of the city. But the truth is much simpler. We realized that total privacy is a myth. The lesson we learned. Across all these homes, from the staged burglaries in the Netherlands to the hidden rooms in Alberta and the watchers in the eye, Pines is that the fences we build are often just psychological. We think that by locking a gate or planting a row of trees, we are creating a barrier that the rest of the world cannot cross. But for the people who live in the shadows, those barriers are just challenges. I still have a habit of checking the walls of every new place I live. I tap on the drywall to see if it sounds hollow. I check the hinges on built-in cabinets. I never leave the curtains open after the sun goes down. My husband thinks I'm being overly cautious, but I know better. I know that the person standing in the grass, just beyond the reach of the porch light, is real. I know that the sound of breathing on the other side of the wall isn't always the wind. The next time you're sitting in your living room, feeling safe and secure in your own private world, I want you to take a moment and listen. Listen to the creaks of the floorboards. Listen to the way the air moves through the vents. And then, I want you to ask yourself, are you really sure you're the only one in the house? Good night, stay safe, and remember, don't forget to lock the back door.